Hi, I'm Marissa Bridge of The Apology Line, and I'm this week's guest on MetaPod.
You're listening to MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them, hosted by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.
Kevin, did you ever own an answering machine?
I certainly don't remember us having one at home in the 1980s. Such was the technological backwater that the small village in Kent that I grew up in was like. In fact, some of the earliest memories I have are walking down to the phone box every Monday evening when my mum would call her parents back in London once a week. So, in other words, we didn't have a phone, let alone something to record inbound messages on.
Okay, fair enough. We also did not have an answering machine in the 80s. And actually, the phone we did have was probably rented or leased from the phone company. But anyway, would you ever put up posters around town that included your phone number and an invitation for strangers to call you and apologize to you for something that they had done wrong to someone else?
Well, as much as I like nowadays listening to gossip and tales of intrigue and mayhem, I'm not sure being the recipient of everyone's true confessions and apologies at scale is something I'd be comfortable with. What about you, Wendy?
No, I think that would be a bit too hefty. Besides, isn't that what Craigslist is for? Okay, well, long before Craigslist, which is mid to late 90s for those of you who are too young to know, there was a man named Allan Bridge who accepted anonymous apologies to an answering machine that he managed from his home. Allan was an artist living in New York City and the person behind a social art experiment that came to be known as the Apology Line, which began in the early 1980s. The project was intended to be a secular confessional for callers, but for Allan, or Mr. Apology as he came to be known, the project spun out in many directions, exploring society, morality, the criminal mind, guilt, and relationships.
So, our guest this week is Marissa Bridge, widow of Allan Bridge and custodian of the Apology Line Project Archive and the narrator of a podcast called The Apology Line. She's also an artist, a painter who is particularly fond of flowers and uses other materials to create mixed media pieces.
Marissa worked with Wondery to produce the Apology Line podcast. Interestingly, you'll hear in our conversation with her that the project, as Allan created it and she and Allan lived it, was much broader than the story presented in the podcast. In addition to the main stories presented in the podcast version of the Apology Line, we talked to Marissa about the original project and its much broader context.
Yeah, Marissa's reflections on life in New York City during the 1980s are fascinating, and we think you'll enjoy hearing those on MetaPod as well as in the Apology Line podcast itself. All right then, Wendy, start the tape.
Welcome to MetaPod, Marissa. It's a pleasure to have you join us this week on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Great. We've really been looking forward to talking to you about the Apology Line. And my first question for you is, was the Apology Line art or a social experiment?
Well, I think of the Apology Line first and foremost as an art project because Allan started it as such and he lived his life as an artist. The project he did prior to the Apology Line was a sculpture called Crime Time. And it was a veiled confession of Allan's own shoplifting, which he had been doing since he was a child. And after he made that sculpture, he stopped shoplifting and he felt a lot better about himself. And so he was looking for a way to help other people do the same thing. And he came up with the idea of using a telephone and an answering machine and started the Apology Line. So for that reason, I think it was an art project. However, Allan was very interested in science, and I think sociology and criminology are sciences. And I think that he had, the scientist mind as well. And he tried to categorize and understand the different types of callers. And so I think that did have a social experiment aspect to it, but for me, it was always an art project.
Can you tell us a bit about the context within which Allan's vision for the project emerged? The political context, the geographic context?
Allan started the project in New York City in the fall of 1980. Allan was, going back a little bit, Allan was born in 1945. So he was one of the first baby boomers. He was born right at the end of World War II and lived through the 50s and the 1960s, which were a time of great change in America. And he was a hippie. I mean, he fully embraced all the cultural things that were going on. He was in Woodstock. He protested at the Chicago convention and had his leg broken when there were riots against the government. He was a liberal, a hippie, and an outsider. New York City in the 1980s was a place that was really down and out. There wasn't any money. New York City had almost gone bankrupt in the 1970s. And there was a lot of drugs floating around. There was a lot of crime, not many police. And so that was the milieu that he found himself in. Also, Ronald Reagan had been elected president in November 1980, and John Lennon was shot in December 1980. And so both those things were a big influence on him. I think the fact that Ronald Reagan was elected president meant that creative people and people of liberal bent were going to have to go underground because there was a change in the air of conservatism in the United States. And he really felt that. Apology Line was an underground project. It was never known to the general public. It was always promoted through media, but alternative magazines and newspapers and things like that. So the time that he started it was a dark time in America.
Marissa, you describe yourself late in the podcast, I believe, as someone who had the last fumes of the hippie era.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Can you tell us what that means then, and maybe looking back at it now?
What that means to me is that I was born in 1956. So by the time I came into consciousness, like say when I was 7 or 8 years old, it was the 60s in America. And I was an avid television watcher, and I saw the hippies on television. I saw the Love-Ins and the Peace and Woodstock and all the great social change. And I thought it was great. I really was like, yes, I'm there, civil rights. There was so much great stuff happening in the 60s. I wanted to be a part of it. I remember I wanted to go to Woodstock very badly, but I was only 11 years old going on 12. And I remember asking my mother if I could go. And she said, no, you're crazy. You're not going there. And I said, can't you take me? And she said, absolutely not. But I wanted to be part of that culture. I grew up in a suburb of Chicago. It was very middle class. My parents were first generation immigrants, and they were Republicans. They were law-abiding citizens, did everything by the book, and didn't want to rock the boat in any way. And I was against all of that from a young person. So when I got to New York in 1974, I was hoping to catch some hippie action, like there would be some peaceful protests or things like that. And when I got to New York City, I went down to Washington Square Park the first day I got there. My school was only a couple blocks away, and there were no hippies. It was the start of the punk generation and Patti Smith and all that. And that turned out to be my generation. And I loved that. I embraced it. But at first I was looking for hippies, and I was looking for that feeling of community that they had, which was very unique to that time, I think. I don't know if there's been any time in America where there was such a community of people, and there was a friendliness. People would hitchhike safely from one end of the country to the other. And that all changed. I think, in the late 60s, and it's never really come back to that. So that's what I mean when I say the fumes of the hippie era. I was looking for that connection, that acceptance, that kind of utopia that I saw on television.
Were you disappointed, or you found something? I guess you found a different community in New York City eventually.
I did. I was disappointed. Disappointed. And, it's quite possible that never really existed, that it was my fantasy. But I like to think that for a brief shining moment in the United States. The young people came together and really had a collective unconscious and made the world a better place for a while. And then it was shattered, of course. But I did find my own group. I found an art community that I was very comfortable with, and I was definitely got very involved in the punk rock scene, not as a performer, but just as an artist and a listener, and would go to clubs and things like that. Got very involved in the club scene in New York City in the 80s. The
story is really intriguing, and as a former criminology graduate myself, I'm interested that you said that just now. So, I wonder, over time, did you sense it was more of a confessional than an apology line?
Well, I think that the podcast definitely had a true crime perspective on it. And that was something that Wondery wanted to do specifically. And I kind of had a lot of pushback on that because there were thousands of calls and there were a lot of apologies, a lot of confessions, and a lot of it was just commentary on other people's calls. So there was a lot more of a community and a lot more variety than we were able to put into the podcast. There were apologies, there were confessions, and there were comments from people from all walks of life. So the podcast, we really didn't have time to give a very broad view of the volume and the variety of callers.
At the outset, did Allan have a definite idea as to what his own reaction was going to be, or did he anticipate what his reaction might be? By which I mean, at the beginning of the messages, it would say, we're not affiliated with any police agency, it's all in confidence, etc., etc. But that kind of obligation on him to listen to all these messages, and as we know from the story, there were some that he did act on and that really had a profound effect on his life as the apology line continued. But from the very beginning, did he think that, okay, I'm just going to listen to these and not do anything about it?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, he didn't know what was to come for him with the apology line. I mean, he had no idea because nothing like this had ever been done before. I think he was open to what would happen. I don't think he expected to run the line as long as he did and for all the things that came about to happen. But in the beginning, he said he would talk to people on the phone if they wanted him to. And from the very first weeks, he did call back people that left phone numbers and said they wanted to speak to him personally. So there was this idea from the beginning of him wanting to interact with people one-on-one, if that's what they wanted.
How long was before it had an impact on him and he started to think quite deeply about some of the things that he was hearing, rather than it being, as you said at the beginning, Marissa, an art project?
As we say in the podcast, it may not be that clear, I'm not sure, but that Mike D, the person that said he mugged and killed homosexuals, called 2 weeks after he started the line in 1980. I met Allan a month after he started the line, and the Mike D situation was already finished by then. So the police got involved right at the beginning. I think he had to face those deep questions a lot sooner than he thought. And that episode he got out of just by, he didn't want to give the information to the police, but he was doing a lot of radio interviews at the time. And he gave that particular call to a radio station to play. So it was put out to the public so the police could hear it or anyone else could hear it. It happened quite early, and his ideas evolved from that experience and through the Ritchie experience. It hit him hard right from the beginning.
We'll come back to the Ritchie phase of the apology line later on, because it is such a critical part of the story. I wonder, was there any temptation after he did I suppose we would call it an art installation, the first time that he kind of played back the messages to visitors to that gallery and everyone had to stand in a phone booth and listen to them? Was there a temptation perhaps to that at that point say, okay, well, I've done my project here, that's great, it's been very successful, it's been interesting as a kind of a cultural phenomenon, and end there? Or was always the temptation, do you sense, Marissa, that he wanted to continue because by then it was almost an intrinsic part of his kind of everyday life almost?
Yes, I think that the new museum exhibition would have been the perfect time to end the line, which was in 1983. He played the calls back to the public, which was what he had promised to do. And it was very well received. And that would have been the time to say, okay, time to move on. But by that point, he was already so involved with the callers and with the types of calls and the volume of calls that he was getting that he really felt like he couldn't let it go. That exhibition forced him to find a way to bring the calls directly to the people rather than having to go through a museum or a gallery, because he realized that most of the callers wouldn't be able to go to the new museum because they were street people or people that were on the fringes, and they didn't feel comfortable going into a highbrow museum. So he really wanted to find a way to bring the work directly to the people who were using the line. And he did that in early 83 by, well, it was the blessing of having the answering machine technology improve enough so that he could put an outgoing message on his answering machine with calls that he had collected. And that was the first time that people could pick up the phone and actually hear the calls through the telephone. The first 3 years of the project, you could not. You could only leave a message. That was a game changer, and that changed everything.
Maybe I'm going to be defining this in a wrong way, or you might have a different interpretation, but some might argue that it was almost like a drug and he became addicted to it. Would that be a fair assessment? And second part to that would be, how quickly do you sense that happened?
Yeah, I think part of it was an addiction. Absolutely. I mean, if you can say that being important to other people and having a purpose and feeling needed, all of those things were aspects of the line that Allan got out of it. You know, he really felt like that was his place. It was a world that he'd created, and he was the facilitator of it. That feeling, I think, was very addictive, of, you know, being needed more than anything else. I mean, I needed him, and, you know, his family needed him, but not in the way that the people calling the line needed him. It was a very acute neediness, and something that he was drawn into deeper and deeper. I would say that it gradually took more and more of his time. But when Richie came along in 1984, right after we got married, unfortunately, that was it. He went off the cliff, you know, and that happened pretty quickly. I mean, I think when Richie called, he thought he'd caught a big fish. You know, he caught someone that was doing something that was very heinous. He claimed to be a serial killer. And Allan thought if he could catch him, if he could get him to stop, those would be amazing things to accomplish as a person. And the fact that he could do that with his art project, I think, was incredibly appealing to him.
The installation at the new museum being affiliated with the new school, they were backing that to some degree, despite it being a fairly ethically complicated project. Were there other institutions in New York City that backed it or questioned the project?
Yes, there was a city museum. I can't remember the name of it right now. It was like the Cultural Institute of New York City. It doesn't exist anymore. It was around for about 10 years, but it was in Columbus Circle, and they did a show about art in New York. And they wanted the apology line based on the success of the new museum show and an article in the New York Times, but they wanted to censor it because they felt like a lot of the material was not going to be suitable, because they were open to the public and they thought families and children might come. And something the new museum wasn't concerned about. That was probably because it wasn't like a family-oriented museum. It was really avant-garde and edgy, but this cultural museum was open to the public, and Columbus Circle is an area of New York City that's very busy, full of tourists and families. And so they played Allan's tapes and they were censored. And so he called his contribution Apology Censored. Oh. And he played the tapes, but only played what they allowed, but he made a very big point of them being censored. And after that, no one else was willing to show them. So that was the end of it. And I think it was mutual. I don't think Allan wanted to be in the art world with it anymore. I think that made him realize he had to take the work directly to the people.
How did he get what was the avenue to the new museum? I mean, in some sense, it's like the ideal place that it could have ended up. Knowing what I know about the new school, but were those just lucky connections or friends that helped out? Money?
No money, definitely. But when Allan was a painter in Washington, D.C., he had a very successful career, and he had reached out to Marcia Tucker, who was the head of the new museum, who had started the new museum, and had sent her his work, his paintings. And I believe he also sent her a portfolio of his machines that he'd made. And she was very interested in his work, but was like, keep sending me your work. I'm not ready for you yet, but I see where you're going. And I think you have a good future. So when he did the apology line, he contacted her again. She was interested, and she sent Ned Rifkin, her chief curator, who's in the podcast briefly. And he came to Allan's loft and heard the tapes and said, yeah, let's do it. The show was called Persona, and Allan had a persona as Mr. Apology. He was never known by his real name while he was alive. It seemed to fit in very well with their theme, and they thought it was an amazing project. So that's how it happened. It was a relationship with Marcia Tucker that he had, nurtured over probably 5 or 6 years.
Was there interest or criticism of the project from institutions, like community aid or religious institutions in New York?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if there were, it's not anything that we ever heard about. Religious people did call the line. Rabbis called, and some priests and people who had pretended to be priests, but they were using it as a confession or apology line. They weren't using it for criticism.
Okay.
It's interesting that, Marissa, because I would imagine just the very concept of it would perhaps not be something that religious institutions would fully support. Would you agree?
I guess so. I mean, we never really thought about that. And even now I'm surprised that we never thought about it. But, I think it was something so separate. I mean, it was a secular confessional, and it was something that was very much of the people. I don't think that Allan ever really gave much thought to what a religious institution would think about it. And as far as I know, he never got any feedback from any institutions. They probably either didn't know about it or just thought it was a troublesome fly, but nothing important. So don't worry about it.
Did Allan ever apologize to you or to his kind of close circle of friends about the boundaries that he was pushing with the project? Or was he very much focused and didn't kind of see the wood for the trees, as it were?
He did not apologize to me or to his friends about his work. And I wouldn't have expected him to. He was one of those people who had incredible focus and dedication to his work. I think that he was willing to pay that price of, like, if I had left or his friends had all just abandoned him, he would have kept with the apology line. I think he felt like what he was doing was important, and it was beneficial for society, and it was helping people. So there was no reason to stop as far as he was concerned, because it was to put it mildly, it was an inconvenience. And, it was much more than that. It was a very, very difficult way to live. And I know that he felt that it was worth it, and that it was something that he felt like became his life's work. It became his mission. So it wasn't something he was sorry for at all.
You said there just briefly that it was a very difficult way to live. Can you kind of describe that environment that made it difficult, both either for you, first of all, obviously, but then perhaps for him?
Well, there were so many ways it was difficult. First of all, he didn't make any money from the project, and he financed it himself. It took all of his time, so he had very little time to make money. And he was a very gifted carpenter and cabinet maker, and he could do anything with his hands, really. He was brilliant. He could do electronics, and he could build a house from scratch. And he did do some apartment renovations early on for work. But, not having money is a difficult way to live. I was working and being an artist as well, and trying to support us as best I could. That's tough. It's tough to realize like your partner is not going to be making a lot of money, and you're going to have to really get in there and work hard. And I did that, and I did it willingly, because I also believed in the apology line. And I felt like it was worthwhile. Yeah, it was very frustrating at times. It was very hard to live with the callers, 24 hours a day, to have these machines in our home and have them going constantly, whether the volume was on or off. After the first couple of years, he did turn the volume down unless he was actively listening. And he would listen with headphones, of course, but sometimes he'd have the volume on while we were eating dinner just to see what was coming in. So that's very difficult. It's like living with humanity passing through. I mean, when I was right out of college, I worked for 1 year at Macy's department store at Herald Square in Crossroads of New York City. And I worked in the the seller stretching these pictures onto art canvas. I remember Christmas time standing by the register where seas of people, I mean, you couldn't walk, just seas of people walking by constantly. You could barely get out of the store. That's what the apology line was like. And it was like living with people from all over the world passing through your house 24 hours a day. I mean, that's what it felt like.
I'm just thinking of the scary wooden escalators in Macy's as well. They look like they would eat your feet.
Yes, I'm sure they did eat some people's feet.
Tell me, you said it's a constant barrage of people calling in, him working on as it developed, in him putting his message on at the beginning and then interacting. What happened when you went on holiday?
What happened was the year after we got married, we went away for 2 months, and he just put on one program tape and let it play and collected the calls when we got back. The year after that, we went away for 1 month because we had bought a boat and we went sailing.
Yeah.
So motoring, I should say. We went motoring. It wasn't a sailboat. After that, we really didn't go many places. So there was a way that he could do it, that he could leave an outgoing message on. And honestly, now that I think about it, it's possible that he would have a neighbor come and change the cassette tape so that he could keep collecting calls, because I don't think he had a shortage of collecting calls while we were away. So he probably made an arrangement with my upstairs neighbor to change the cassette tape.
I'm curious if you can explain, did he have the same moral compass that perhaps the general population would be deemed to have? Because in some of the writings that you talk about on the podcast, he struggles with his own, the way he would approach various things. And I think, another way of kind of phrasing the question would be, what were his kind of boundaries between right and wrong? Were they the same as yours, say, or were they slightly different, do you think?
No, I think that they were the same. I think he understood morality, and he understood basically what's right and what's wrong. I think that what he was aiming for with the apology line, and I assume you're talking about the criminality that he was so fascinated with.
Correct.
Was that he wanted to understand the criminal mind, because he felt he had a criminal mind. He felt like if he hadn't had different parents, he might have been a serious criminal himself. But he was raised, in a very middle class family and was well loved by his parents. He had a very solid foundation, but he was interested in criminals and criminality because he did have a dark side to him. He was someone that built bombs in his basement when he was an adolescent, and his parents actually sent him to a psychiatrist because they were very worried about him doing that, understandably. And the psychiatrist recommended that he go to a summer camp where the boys learned how to shoot guns, rifles. They did that, and that actually cured him of his bomb building. He needed to get out some kind of aggression, I guess, and that actually worked. But he was a hunter. He was a spear fisherman. He hunted pheasants. He was a predator in that sense. If he liked hunting and killing animals, he would always eat them. It wasn't like he just hunted and didn't eat what he killed. I mean, I think that's morally wrong, but he did enjoy that. He had that predatory nature, and he was, that was something that he and I struggled with, because I mean, I'm going to say I'm a little bit hypocritical because I do eat fish and I do eat some poultry and I don't kill it myself. So, but I think the fact of going out and killing something yourself is hard for me to grasp even today. In my heart of hearts, I'd love to be vegan. And my husband and I now try to eat vegan a few meals a week, because that's the direction I personally would like to go into. But yeah, he had that side of him, and a lot of people do. And I think that he used the apology line to really explore that. And the people that called that had the same issues that he had, he was very interested in.
Yeah.
In the podcast, you talk about having 2 premonitions in your life. Maybe there's been more since then, but did you ever tell Allan about either of those at any point? I mean, obviously the last one, maybe the timing was difficult, but were those feelings that you discussed with Allan or anyone else?
I never discussed them with Allan. He was not the kind of person to believe in premonitions.
Mm.
He did have that scientific background, and he would have just thought I was being silly.
Mhm.
That's where he and I were very different, in that I believe in intuition and I believe in premonition. Those are the only two premonitions I've ever had, but they were both so strong and connected to Allan. For
Mhm.
some reason, I was meant to be the person that was with him during those apology line years. I don't know why, but here we are today still talking about it. And
Mhm.
maybe that's why. I mean, it's possible that I had the qualifications necessary, even though I didn't know it at the time. And it was something that was meant to be, that I would be the person that would carry on his work after he passed away. I really don't know, but no, he would not have appreciated it at all.
Okay. Have you had any personal safety concerns since doing the podcast and it becoming
Hmm.
accessible to a bigger audience?
No, I haven't. I have had a lot of people reaching out to me on social media, and a couple of people got my phone number and my email address, which I had on my art website.
Mhm.
So I took that stuff off. At the beginning, people had access to it, but nobody was really threatening or anything like that. No, it's been great actually to connect with people that listened to the podcast and enjoyed it. Especially great connecting with original apology line callers. That's been amazing.
Mhm.
Yeah. Related question, if I may, Marissa. I mean, at the height of the Richie era, if we can call it that, um,
Hmm.
which for those people listening was a caller that was threatening to do lots of pretty nasty things and claimed that he had done lots of nasty things. Was that a period where you ever felt concerned for your own safety, or indeed, I'm guessing Alan's, because he decided to try and pursue this gentleman through his own kind of private investigator hat almost?
Right. I think at the beginning of the Ritchie era, which was 5 years that he
Yeah.
called Alan and they were very involved, I was worried because Alan was fascinated with him from the beginning, and Ritchie really enjoyed the attention Alan was giving him. So he called a lot. At some point, a few years into it, they started having private conversations off the apology line. And I was worried at the beginning, but Ritchie would assure Alan again and again that he didn't want to hurt him, that he wasn't interested in hurting him, that he was enjoying their relationship, and it wasn't something that he was going to do. So I think that I understood what Ritchie was saying, and I believed him after a couple of years of Alan relating to him.
Mm.
That I didn't really think Ritchie was going to come and do anything to Alan. Now, if Alan found Ritchie, what would happen? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I was hoping that Alan would never do that, that it would never come to that. Alan would be confronting Ritchie.
Yeah. What is it about Ritchie, do you think, that drew Alan to him? Because there were other callers to the apology line that were making claims of other extremely serious crimes. What was the spark, if that's the right word, that ignited their relationship?
I think the first thing that drew Alan's interest was Ritchie's demeanor on the line, that he was very well spoken. He had an excellent vocabulary. He spoke very calmly, very clearly, and very matter of factly about these horrible things he was doing. He'd claimed to be a serial killer, and he would go to Times Square in New York City and pick up homeless people or sailors who were AOL or different people that he felt would not be easily traced, and would take them home and torture them and kill them for his own sexual gratification. So the fact that he went into such great detail and sounded so convincing, yet so matter of fact about it, really drew Alan in. Ritchie sounded so real that Alan really thought that was having these conversations with a serial killer who was active in New York City, 20 blocks away from where we lived.
Mm. To me, having listened to all of it now, I find the Ritchie thing very disturbing, not least, and I don't think we're spoiling things for listeners because it does come to a conclusion that isn't a nasty one based on what we've just been talking about. But I actually found the relationship that he developed with the woman who was suffering from domestic abuse actually slightly more disturbing than the Richie one. And I don't know whether that says something more about me or something else. I mean, how do you compare those two cases, if we can call them that?
There are some similarities in that, they both called the line and they both wanted help but refused help from Allan. I think, both of them didn't really want to make change in their lives. I think that was something that tied them together. But I think that with Sam, the abused wife, she was a very sympathetic character. People really identified with her, especially the women callers. People really didn't sympathize with Richie. He wasn't someone that you could really identify with unless you were really a perverted person yourself.
Yeah.
So there were some major differences. And the reason you may have been more upset with Sam is because the fact that she could have gotten help from Allan so easily and she didn't take it. And I was actually thinking about Sam. I was listening to this Brene Brown podcast the other day, and she was interviewing a Holocaust survivor. And what she said was, the day that Auschwitz was liberated, the gates were opened and some of the prisoners walked out. And then after a few minutes, they walked right back in because they didn't know how to be free. And when I heard that, I really thought about Sam, because I think that when someone's being abused, they don't know what it would mean to be free. And I think that she was not able to work towards her own freedom. The day that Allan met her in Central Park and he offered her a plane ticket or that she could stay with us, she couldn't take it. She couldn't take his offer because she didn't feel like she was able to be free.
Marissa, a question about the tapes. Are they all original in the podcast? Were there any dramatizations or anything that needed to be recreated?
Oh, no. They're all original.
Okay.
Allan recorded every conversation he ever had related to the apology line. And sometimes he recorded just himself talking about the apology line.
Mm-hmm.
So everything was original.
Oh, okay. And nothing had to be restored or anything like that? Everything's in good condition?
It's kind of amazing. The originals are in very good condition. About 10 years ago, I made 3 cassette copies of every cassette original because I was working on a play with someone that the project never came to fruition, but just for safekeeping, I made 3 cassette copies of every original. And then Wondery paid to digitize all the tapes.
Okay.
So they digitized hundreds of cassette tapes. But yeah, they're all in, the originals are in amazingly good condition. A couple of times I played an original through my microphone and sent the finished piece through Logic Pro to Wondery, and they used that actual footage in the podcast.
Okay.
So, and people did complain that sometimes the sound quality was very bad. That was one of the complaints we got. And Wondery didn't want to change them too much.
Yeah.
There were a couple that they had to work on a little bit, but they really didn't do that much alterations on those original tapes.
Okay. I think they come off pretty well, actually. I mean, I've heard worse things in terms of sound quality. So you had mentioned earlier that the podcast maybe includes a limited range of stories and from people that called in originally. Are there other storylines that have been used in other media or formats, or are there other storylines that could be told about the project that haven't been yet, rather than this true crime line that you've mentioned?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are many. I identified for a possible another project 47 storylines.
Oh.
And that wasn't the full list, but those were like sort of 47 main storylines that an episode could be built on, or a couple of episodes, or more than that. There's just a ton of material.
Mm. And is there anything that you would like to happen with the material that exists that hasn't happened yet?
Oh, yes. This material hasn't been put out anywhere since the day that Allan played each program tape originally. Like every 2 weeks for 13 years, he played a program of the calls of the previous 2 weeks. So that's what I call the program tapes. Aside from the one time he played them to the public through his telephone, they have never been played. And we used only a fraction in the podcast. We because the Richie material was so much of, it was 2.5 of 6 episodes. So right there, we didn't get a chance to use much else. I would like to put that material out to the public. Wondery and I are talking about doing a season 2, but what they want to do and what I want to do are kind of 2 different things. I'm not sure yet what's going to happen with a season 2, but regardless, I think that I would like to ultimately put Allan's program tapes out to the public so that people could hear the breadth of the project from beginning to end. I think that would be really remarkable. I don't expect people to listen straight through, but if you wanted to, you could. And I think it's an enormously important archive of the way people were thinking and feeling at the end of the 20th century.
Yeah. I'm curious though, because obviously I'm British, and I've asked Wendy this, who used to live in New York herself a number of years ago. I wonder whether something like the apology line is very kind of exclusive to New York and its people and its scene, compared to, say, somewhere like London, where arguably British people are a little bit more reserved. Is that something that you would agree with, or do you think it is a universal concept?
I do think it's a universal concept.
Okay.
And I think that Allan welcomed people to start their own apology lines. And a few people have over the years. And in fact, I know of 2 that have sprouted since the podcast because people are being inspired by it. But they never last because it takes an enormous amount of dedication to run the line. I think it's not enough to just have a tape running or a voicemail and collect these people's thoughts, because when you're expressing these emotions, you want a response. You need someone to acknowledge that they've heard you. And Allan devoted his life to them. And if you don't do that, people don't keep calling. It's as simple as that. I mean, so I've seen a lot of apology lines come and go over the 25 years since Allan has died, and none of them have lasted.
Okay. There's an odd thing to say, but there are a couple of moments where I did laugh out loud when I was listening to it. The first one was when there's the competition comes up, and there's a rather overly sultry voice says "True Confessions," which just sounded rather strange. I mean, what was your first kind of reaction when you started hearing the different interpretation of it?
Yeah, the 900 numbers.
Yeah.
Yes. Allan was furious, as you could gather from the podcast, because he felt like this was something he devoted his life to and didn't make any money, didn't charge the callers. And here was someone coming along and charging them a lot of money to call and apologize. But in the end, I think that line was more sexual titillation than anything else. And I think people would call and say, I'm sorry, I slept with my husband's brother or whatever, and it didn't last either. That line didn't last more than a year or 2.
The other really funny moment is when you play a segment from the film interpretation, which I've not seen the film. I've had no desire to go and watch it, but it sounds terrible. Was it as bad as it sounds in the clips that you played on the podcast?
It was pretty bad. However, it did win an award in France. It was released as a feature film in France and won some kind of award. So there you go.
That was put out by HBO?
It was put out by HBO, and it was a television movie in the US, but it was released as a feature film in Europe. Lucky you guys.
Indeed. And last of all, I mean, the podcast, our conversation now is drawn very closely to the serious parts of it. But I'm assuming that there was some actually really funny messages that were left, possibly, or the way that people were apologizing, and just the way people talk is often funny. I mean, could it be possible that there could be, a different version of the podcast or the apology line that is, 101 funny confessions from New Yorkers, and just completely flip it the other way?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's hundreds of funny calls. One of the funniest ones that I think we played on the bonus episodes that were on Wondery Plus, but there was a young boy, a teenager who was on the phone. He had called the apology line. He was saying that he was masturbating and he loves beautiful women, and he's just winding himself up. And then his mother picks up the phone and says, "What the hell are you doing on the phone?" And he's like, "Oh, mom, I'm just hanging up talking to my friend." She's like, "You've been on the phone for 20 minutes, get off." And it's hysterical. Because back then you didn't have your own cell phone. There was usually one phone in the house and everybody had to share it. He got caught. And there's a lot of stuff like that. And some kids calling and just saying really funny things. We could do a funny, a humor one. Absolutely.
I was just going to say, it would be quite fitting if you'd got a call from a Frenchman saying, "What is this shit you've sent to us in the cinema?" or something like that. We've come to the end of our time here on MetaPod this week. So thank you so much, Marissa Bridge from the Apology Line. It's been lovely talking to you, and it's a terrific podcast. And we'll put lots of links to various things, including your own artwork, on the story that accompanies this. But once again, thanks, Marissa, for joining us on MetaPod.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It's been great talking to you both.
Thank you, Marissa.
Thanks so much to Marissa for taking the time to talk to us about the Apology Line. Not only the podcast, but the real-life experiment that she and Allan lived for more than a decade. It's a fascinating story and a brilliant podcast, if a little unsettling at times, I think.
Yes, but I really enjoyed hearing stories about New York City of the past. And Kev, we should really also thank Joe, Marissa's husband. Remember that Joe gave up his desk temporarily so that Marissa could talk to us in a more comfortable spot. We also learned from Marissa how supportive Joe's been of the Apology Line and bringing the story to a broader audience. So thank you, Joe.
Indeed. Thank you, Joe. Right. As always, you'll find show notes for this episode on metapodshow.com. There is plenty to discover about the original project and Allan, and there's also a Facebook community devoted to the Apology Line. You can learn more about Marissa and her art at marissabridge.com. We've put links for you on the MetaPod website, as always.
And it's a good moment to remind you, dear MetaPod listeners, that we're going to a fortnightly schedule for June, July, and August.
That's right. We'll be back on Wednesday, June the 9th, with US documentary and filmmaker Nina Gilden-Seavey. We'll be discussing Nina's new podcast, My Fugitive, which examines a tangle of events that took place in the 1960s as part of the civil rights movement in the US, and the attempts that the US government and the FBI made to suppress the movement and its leaders. Our conversation with Nina goes a lot deeper than the podcast, which is terrific, actually. It includes issues around trust in state institutions, surveillance, and a lot more.
Yes, sounds good. So until then, please don't forget to send us your comments for the MetaPod mailbag and leave a rating for us on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. Okay, so that's all from us for now.
Okay, we'll see you next time.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. MetaPod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.